Hi again. Today we're going to be looking at the configurable TDP settings on this Ryzen 3 4350G. We're going to be using this B550 motherboard from ASRock again with 16GB of RAM. There's an M2 SSD in here, NVMe 250GB, and we're using a 1TB SSD for additional storage. This is mainly games and benchmarks and that kind of thing. Power supply used today is going to be the Corsair CX430. It's a very basic power supply, cheap but does the job, and it's probably gives you a decent reading. You probably pair this kind of PSU with this kind of setup anyway. Power readings are going to be taken using this power meter here. So this is our setup for today. Now the cTDP settings are only really available on AMD APUs, from what I can tell. The reason for this will become clear in this video, since this setting doesn't actually do what you might expect. So what I did was I used the three built-in settings, which was 35 watt, 45 watt and 65 watt, to see what performance impacts they had, as well as any difference in power consumption. I ran the test multiple times since the results I got were not what I was expecting, and we'll get into that in more detail in a minute. So let's get started, shall we? First up, we'll look at the 65 watt preset, which is basically the out-of-box performance and should give you the best results without overclocking. At idle, the machine draws a little over 25 watts. In CPU Z, we get the expected result of 494 single-threaded and 2700 multi-threaded. So on par with a 7700K i7 Kaby Lake. During this test, we had a peak power draw of 57 watts, and in Cinebench, it's pretty much the same story. The performance is as expected with 2,330 points, but this time the peak power draw was 72.9 watts, so a little bit higher. But all within what you'd expect for 65 watt TDP. Next, I ran a set of 3D Mark benchmarks, with the results being 1,247 in TimeSpy, 3,312 in Firestrike, 13,239 in Night Raid, and finally 6,859 in Wildlife. And during this I saw a peak power draw of 57.1, and that was during the second benchmark of Firestrike. So that's given us a baseline for basic benchmarks with some power draw figures. So let's look at a game. I've chosen Rogue Company for this since it runs very well on the CPU. I benchmarked a whole match and I saw an average of about 73 FPS, which is once again about what I expected. Next up, I ran the Final Fantasy 15 and Final Fantasy 14 benchmarks, since that's what I had installed on this machine, so it seemed like a good idea to run them. In Final Fantasy 15, this machine scored 2,320, and in Final Fantasy 14 it scored 5,353. And once again, this is about what I expected. This gives us a baseline for these benchmarks at 65 watt. I also ran the Final Fantasy 15 benchmark on a loop for an hour to try and get an average power draw, which in this case was 55 watts average, or 0.058 kilowatt hours. So far so good. Now things get a little weird. Setting the configurable TDP to 45 watt, I ran the same benchmarks, games and tests again, and the results were pretty much identical. So we got a idle power draw of 25.3 watts, which is not a surprise because it is idle. But in CPU Z, we marginally get slightly better performance than the 65 watt, which is just, we'll just call that an outlier, with a power draw of 55.2. So at this point I repeated all the tests 3 times with each setting, and here were the results. The power consumption was the same throughout. The only real difference was when I applied a slight undervolt, but over the 1 hour benchmark it didn't make any real difference in terms of this power meter. It read exactly the same, so it's negligible really. It's the same story with the 3D mark benchmarks. As you can see, there's absolutely no difference, all within the margin of error of each other. So for whatever reason, each setting here performs exactly the same. So at this point I either thought the motherboard was faulty, or the setting just doesn't work and it's all just smoke and mirrors. But clearly there's something going on. So if we look at Rogue Company, there was actually a difference between the 3 settings. At 65 watt we were getting 73 FPS average. At 45 watt we got 71, and lastly at 35 watt we got 65 watt average. So there's clearly a decrease here, and it's just odd that the power consumption seems to remain the same. So in the Final Fantasy 14 and Final Fantasy 15 benchmarks, we also saw a slight difference with the performance decreasing as we lowered the settings. Once again, nothing major, but there is a clear change in performance when the setting was decreased. So maybe there's some kind of throttling going on with the GPU, and that for some reason the 3D mark benchmarks don't pick it up. Possibly because the Final Fantasy benchmarks run for about 7-8 minutes, whereas the 3D mark benchmarks only run for about a few minutes and there's little gaps in between where it's loading. Whereas the Final Fantasy benchmarks are just, well, Final Fantasy 15 at least is constant. So at this point I ran CPU-Z just to see what happens in a long stress test. This I found did make a difference, but one in Windows, HW monitor, CPU-Z and ASRock's A-Tune all still reported the CPU running at 4 GHz throughout, but there was clearly some throttling going on. I didn't take detailed notes here. This was more quickly checking and watching the screen while I was working. At 65 watts, it took about an hour for the result to start throttling. It drops down to about 915, and after a few minutes it will jump back up to around about 2000. It never quite gets back to 2500, but it just jumps between 900 and 2000. At 45 watts, it took about 40 minutes to drop to 738, and it never really got back to above 2000. So it didn't take as long, and it was the throttling was more severe. At 35 watts, we saw the biggest throttle, and the performance dropped down to 372, and that was after about 30 minutes. And once again, never really recovering. Now, while this behaviour seems very odd, it's worth pointing out, if you undervolt the Zen 2 CPU too much, you cause the performance to drop despite the clock speed not actually changing. So what I think we are seeing here is a dynamic undervolt occurring. I want to double check this using the Ryzen Master software, but unfortunately it doesn't work on the CPU, which is fine, and for whatever reason the ASRock A-Tune interface doesn't give detailed enough readings of what's going on, so I can't quite work that out. So if anyone knows, please let me know. So in conclusion, what is the point of the cTDP setting of the CPU? Well, it doesn't seem to be for power saving, and it seems to mainly be just for thermals, which I suppose you would expect for a TDP setting, and it seems to only really affect the GPU, though throttling does occur earlier on the CPU side. So we've got a strange picture of stuff going on here. What's odd is the fact that even in the Final Fantasy 15 benchmark loop, we read about the same overall power over the course of the hour. It might be because this isn't sensitive enough, but I would expect at least a slight difference. Maybe if I ran it for, let's say, 24 hours, we might actually see a difference, but I don't have the time for that. So 1 hour was, well, I say 1 hour, I had to run it 3 hours each time, so it was 9 hours of benchmarking Final Fantasy 15. So why would you ever use this setting? Well, I would recommend leaving it alone. It has no purpose whatsoever in a normal machine. But let's say you're building a very small machine and you want it to be as silent as possible. I suspect you may notice a difference over the course of like a day in terms of thermals of a cTDP setting of 35 rather than the 65 watt. I have a passive heatsink for an AM4 and a small case. I may try that to see if we do actually see any difference, but I am not confident that is the case. But it's certainly worth a try if you have this an AMD APU and a small case and you want to try and get a more silent setup. Now I suppose there we have it. That's the cTDP setting for the Ryzen 3 4350G processor. Now I would say this video has been a bit of a failure, but I've learned something new, so not an entire failure, and I hope you learned something new too. I will revisit this another day because I want to look at the undervolting and overclocking of this CPU, because I think you can probably achieve better thermals and better power consumption with an undervolt. This CPU in particular doesn't seem to want to undervolt very far, but I will look at that in more detail. And there was some oddness going on there as well, but I might have a look at what I can do with that. Maybe increasing turbo and little things like that. In the meantime, if you're trying to build a small machine that's low power and low noise, I would not recommend buying the G processor and using the cTDP settings. Look out for a GE processor. Though after seeing these results, I'm less confident in recommending those at the moment. Or a Intel T processor. Now, while they have their own problems regarding their turbo using a lot more power, especially in the newer processors, they, at least from my experience, definitely do work for small machines. I do suspect the GE version will work as well, but I'm a little confused about what AMD are doing here. But at some point in the future, I will do a video probably comparing a GE processor to a modern T processor. I have a lot of T processors lying around. I do like them a lot, so I'll do a video on those as well at some point. One of my computers that I use daily uses it's an Ivy Bridge T processor, and I use it for pretty much everything. It's a great little processor, and I will do a video of that at some point in the future. So if you like this video, please like, comment or subscribe, and feel free to check out some of my other videos. This is currently a very new channel, and I'm trying to break the 1000 sub mark, hopefully some point in the next 6 months. So there's only a handful of videos at the moment, but please feel free to check it out. Watch time and subs are very important for a very new channel. So if you do watch some of my videos, if you could watch it through to the end, or just leave it running in the background, that'd be great. But that's it for today. Thanks for watching, and I suppose I'll see you again next time. So, goodbye.